government has announced that they have a plan to become the world leader in crypto assets. So we're going to be discussing that today and all the different players. So a bit of background, 8 years ago, I was a founding director of the UK Digital Currency Association, and our goal was to support the UK in doing just that at a time when no country would support our industry and nobody cared. I can't remember whether it's 2013, 2014, but 8 years later, they set out their plan as crypto assets become something that they can no longer ignore. So there is no coincidence that this is happening right now. The reason this is happening right now is because the world is getting ready and set for currency wars. And those that win the currency wars are going to be those that have the most tools. And those that have the least tools will be the ones that are following bans. And those with the most tools will be the ones that are following the plan of embracing this new and emerging industry. The leader in that space is in fact Japan, and Japan has been doing that since 2014, very quietly planning for this moment. And then many other countries have come along, and some countries have gone full Bitcoin, countries like El Salvador, and we have various different degrees in between. So what I'm going to be doing in this video is actually explaining why this is happening right now when we follow the money, follow the narrative, as opposed to why it didn't happen 8 years ago. And the first thing is because this is such a significant industry, you cannot ignore it anymore. When you try to ignore it, all the innovation, all the tax and all the jobs go to another country, and you lose a vital war in the upcoming, a vital tool rather, in the upcoming currency wars that countries will need when we enter into the monetary renegotiation that I forecasted in a video I uploaded to YouTube in 2011 called The Great Depression of the 2020s. Okay, so let's jump straight in. So the first thing is to notice that the press release was released on the gov.uk website, gov.co.uk, I believe. Gov.co.uk is the government website, and we confuse the government with this one ginormous organization that is well coordinated without understanding that there are lots of competing agendas within the governments as well. So let's go through some of those competing agendas, and the fact that this wasn't launched just on the FCA website, or just on the HMRC website, or just on the Royal Mint's website, or just on the central bank's website is significant. So let's go through each of those players and what they care about and what this means, and more importantly, what it means for you. So firstly, if you are not in the UK, this is the action that I forecast most countries will follow eventually. They may go through some kind of threat of a ban initially, and then they'll realize what a bad idea that is, and all the jobs, tax collection, and taking everything out of their country that they care about. So they will eventually look at something similar to this. If you are in the UK, this is what it means for you. So the first player to be aware of is the UK FCA. The UK FCA stands for the Financial Conduct Authority, and the Financial Conduct Authority is the UK regulator. The UK regulator is implementing a sandbox, and they're mainly focusing on the word crypto asset and stable coins. Now, this sandbox has actually been around for a long time, so they're repackaging an old headline. The sandbox is essentially a way for a startup and a company to go into a regulatory sandbox and have additional protections for innovating on top of the existing laws. It's a great thing for a startup. So if you are a startup in the UK doing something innovative with stablecoins, DeFi, crypto assets, then a sandbox is a great environment for you to be able to get a front door to the regulations, explain to them what they do, and get a controlled environment to exercise your innovation without the threat of law enforcement if you abide by those rules. So what types of rules do they care about? Well, the UK FCA, firstly, used to be, and most regulators around the world, used to be about consumer protections. So they originally came around because, snake oil salespeople were selling stocks and shares and having completely misleading statements, really shenanigans, ripping off people. And so regulations was decided that it needed for consumer protection. Over time, that morphed into gaining the information for tax collection and was superseded after 9/11 by the anti-money laundering laws. And therefore, AML just became the predominant thing that superseded everything. So if you think about it, consumer protection would encourage more privacy and uploading less documents, because when you upload documents, they are at the risk of cyber attacks and identity theft. But AML laws, anti-money laundering laws, supersede privacy, data protection, and consumer protection in most cases. And so what do they care in anti-money laundering laws? Well, there's a few things. If they are looking at crypto assets and stable coins, they want to ascertain know your customer, which is ensuring those annoying selfies that we all have to do whenever we sign up to a site. And then they biometrically connect it with your facial recognition by taking a photo so that they can ensure you are who you say you are. And there's technology implemented into that to ensure that you're not under duress and someone's putting a gun to your head, and various other things that know your customer technology and RegTech has produced over the years. The second thing they care about is source of funds. They want to ensure that the funds that you are sending, they know where they came from, in case they need to trace it back. And they want source of wealth to ensure that they know how you obtained your wealth that you're investing into that stable coin or crypto asset in the first place. They also need transaction monitoring, which is that you have a way of stopping or blocking transactions whenever they are, that you have a way of monitoring those transactions, i.e. blockchain analysis. And various other things that are, and risk ratings. So if you come, for example, from Russia, that would attain a high risk, and we have to do all sorts of social profiling and discriminatory acts in order to put together a risk rating in order to adhere to laws, anti-money laundering laws. These are laws, so if you break them, you either get fined or go to prison. So they are laws, they have to be enforced. On the side, they care a bit about consumer protection, which is ensuring that shenanigans are not being sent and scams are not being marketed, and so that there's effective disclosures so that you know what you're investing into, which then goes into securities laws. And the FCA are the enforcer of securities laws, and they can determine whether these are going to be securities, currencies, or whatever. And there was a bogey clause in the FCA's mandate, which is around increasing effective competition. And so this means that they have to have effective competition into the legacy system, which means that they need to embrace such things, and which keeps it, in this world of sandboxes and embracing new technology as it goes through. Okay, so that is the regulator, the FCA. Who's next on the list that was listed? The next one is the Royal Mint. So what do the Royal Mint do? What have they got to be involved in this? Well, the Royal Mint is the creator of cash and coins. So when you have a £10 note or a £20 note or a £50 note or a £5 note, they decide every few years to recycle those, reinvent the note so that you then have to swap in your old notes for new notes. And therefore they put some better technology to make it endurable in note form. And there has been a war on cash over time. So what they do is they make you swap it in so that if you are engaging in criminal activities, eventually your notes expire and then they can swap it for a new note, and eventually you have to go to a bank and digitize that note. They also create coins, which used to be gold, and then it was turned into silver, and then it was debased and debased until eventually it was copper and very, very cheap materials, so that it had no intrinsic value. The reason for that is because the Royal Mint actually sends across all profits to the Treasury. And it actually reduces the amount of tax that you need to pay. It is called seigniorage income. And seigniorage income is the profits to governments from creating money. And by money, I mean currency, and by currency, I mean cash and coins, not the digital currency. And so that money, they also release special coins made out of gold and sell those, and that reduces. So you can look up, if you look at the budget, you'll see a little segment there called seigniorage income. And this is important. It's very insignificant right now because the government decided to outsource the creation of currency to the private banks and to a lesser degree the central banks. And so the private banks actually create most digital currency. So what does the Royal Mint care about? Two agendas here. Firstly, the Royal Mint needs to increase its seigniorage income, of course. And so they will be releasing what's known as a non-fungible token, an NFT. And an NFT is an experiment. Essentially, most of them are launched on the Ethereum network and competition to Ethereum. And essentially, it is a token, unlike Bitcoin, which is mainly fungible. There are some properties that make it less fungible. But a non-fungible is designed to not be fungible. It is a unique token. It exists on the blockchain, and you can transport it. Now, those non-fungible tokens, this becomes pretty interesting because a school of thought is that people are investing in them and make them securities, because if you don't make them securities, then everyone will create non-fungible tokens of all assets, and therefore it will disrupt the financial markets and create problems, much like it did in the ICO boom in 2017, when everyone was circumventing securities laws by creating tokens. And then those tokens, if they were allowed to circumvent securities laws, would have been created by all public companies, and it would have created disruption in the stock markets and decades of regulatory regimes that were set up for stock market and public offerings. So NFTs are in that same camp. Now, interestingly, if the Royal Mint creates an NFT, does it have to be sold in compliance with securities laws? If it doesn't have to be sold in compliance with securities laws, does that mean that it's not a security? And if it's not a security, is it a special virtual asset service provider regime, which they have in the UK? Or is it a currency? That becomes an interesting question. Does it change its form if it's created by the Royal Mint, or could anyone create an NFT and follow the same regulatory regime? Interesting scenario that will come up, so watch that one closely. But the second important thing here is the Royal Mint needs to be involved, because if the government one day in the upcoming currency wars decided to take back the control of money and create, similar to what there is a bill for in the US called eCash, then the Royal Mint would be the institution responsible for increasing seigniorage income, the profitability of Treasury, so that it can reduce taxes by having profits from creating money and taking it back from the private banks and the central banks. So this experiment could be a very important factor, because the Royal Mint could become a way more significant institution than it currently has when all money creation has been outsourced. So ramping up the efforts at the Royal Mint and digitizing and modernizing away from just releasing its gold coins could be a fundamental, important tool in the upcoming financial weapons of mass destruction in the upcoming currency wars. Right, who else do we have next? So go a layer up. You've had the FCA. You've got HMRC. HMRC only cares about one thing, and that is tax. Its books do not balance. It's the government spends a lot more than it taxes. And so they care about making sure that they get their chunk of tax. The way you do that is you implement anti-money laundering laws, And by implementing anti-money laundering laws, you get to control all the data, regulating the financial institutions so that you can get access to that data, and therefore the HMRC gets its fair chunk of tax because it's made a lot of liabilities. It operates the Treasury, only gets that seigniorage income, that tax income, and the rest it needs to borrow. So it has to go to investment banks in order to sell bonds. It borrows that money, and then the central bank then creates some money in order to purchase those bonds, or investors do it. And therefore, when you are saying things like tax the rich, which is the big debates at the moment, because the cost of living crisis for the poor is unaffordable, I completely understand that, but understand what that means. If you tax the rich, then it will just simply lead to more of the rich leaving the country, and therefore it leads to more money needing to be borrowed by governments, because when you're rich you tend to spend more money, which generates more tax. I completely understand the sentiment, the Robin Hood theory, take from the rich to give to the poor, and that's what governments are meant to do. But all of these policies tends to have the opposite of the desired effect, where the rich end up leaving the country for a more tax efficient environment, and therefore you end up increasing the taxes on the poor. And also the bond market is a function of your pension. So the more bonds that are created, the number one buyer of those bonds, other than when the central bank is doing quantitative easing, is your pension. So what that means when you tax the rich is you're taxing your grandma. So your grandma's going to end up, paying essentially for this. So we don't want to tax grandma, but that's the end effect of these policies. Why? I covered a video on this yesterday. Check it out yesterday. Was it yesterday that we did? Yes, the environmental crisis, the cost of living crisis, and working through the flows. I think it was a video before anyway, one of the last few videos on where we covered the effects of this as well. It was part of the environmental crisis video, yes. HMRC only cares about tax. That's why they want to make sure that stablecoins and crypto assets implement many of the rules that the FCA will implement in the sandbox, so that they can get their chunk of tax. And whatever your beliefs about tax are, whether it's theft or whether it's a fundamental thing that you have to do to contribute to society, no judgment there. Depends if you sit on the left or you sit on the right. Just telling you the facts of what HMRC obviously cares about. Now let's go up another layer. The next layer up above the Royal Mint. So you had the FCA, you had HMRC, you had the Royal Mint. You then have the central bank. Now what does the central bank care about? Well, the central bank is meant to care about inflation and financial stability. Yikes, the Bank of England. You're doing an awful job, because your real job is to fund wars. We know that because that is what it was created for in 1694, and that is what it has done ever since. And financial stability it used to be a place where people would store their gold as a custodian of gold, but since confiscating that from countries like Venezuela that store their gold with you, it becomes a political tool and another financial weapon of mass destruction, and it has enabled the entire growth of the fiat Ponzi scheme, because money has been outsourced to the private banking sector, backed by debt, and so therefore interest rates becomes a function of how much money the banks are going to create, and a distortionary advice when you end up buying those products from banks like we had in the 2007 financial crisis, where all the retail banks were creating mortgages. Why were they creating mortgages? Because they could sell them to the investment bank, and then the investment bank could then repackage them and they could sell them to your pension. And rather than allow your pension to go bust, you ended up paying again in inflation and bailouts. And then those bailouts were used, and then the central bank ended up acquiring all those assets and sitting it on its balance sheet, and then started to operate over a deeper and deeper Ponzi scheme, all because way back in 1971, President Nixon reneged on the gold standard agreement, and therefore there was no cost and consequence, and the Bank of England ends up keeping all the gold, and then you have this Ponzi scheme where they have to look after the Ponzi scheme in order to maintain financial stability at the expense of business cycles, and inevitably, predictably, and guaranteed an increase in debt. And an increase in debt means more inflation, and more inflation means a cost of living crisis. A cost of living crisis means that the rich are okay if they invested in assets. The poor that consumed, that didn't invest in assets, are not okay, and you end up with ginormous divide and at the extreme, a shift in an empire when the world reserve currency changes, and you end up with these geopolitical warfare as a result of using these currencies to expand your military, which was covered in the environmental crisis video yesterday. I covered a lot more on the military and war side in the environmental crisis video. So if you didn't check it out, I really suggest you check that one out. Okay, so the central banks, what do they care about? Well, they want to ensure that the Royal Mint does not take over the control of money. And so therefore, they want their central bank digital currency. The central bank digital currency is their way of ensuring that if the banks get out of line, they can replace the banks with a central bank digital currency. What do they need? If they are to perform the role of regulator and to stay significant with those toxic assets on their balance sheet, then they need a regulatory regime from the FCA that ensures that the UK is a leader of financial innovation. Why do they need the UK to be a leader of financial innovation? Well, when you replace banks with central bank digital currencies, you remove to API-based banking, which is essentially technology where financial technology companies can build on top of the central bank digital currency. Excuse me. So you have to create an FCA sandbox in order to ensure that you have a buoyant financial technology scene because banks have spent years building all these branches and networks. And if you replace it with a central bank digital currency, you lose all those branches. All those branches move over to financial technology companies, and banks will essentially become financial technology companies, especially if they remove the ability for them to create money by introducing a central bank digital currency, which is the reversal of fractional reserve banking, where banks create digital currencies every time they issue a loan. You're replacing non-debt-based money from the debt-based money that is the world's largest regulated Ponzi scheme. So what does the central bank need to ensure? They need to ensure a buoyant financial technology scene, and they need to ensure that the government doesn't figure out that they can increase their seigniorage income through the Royal Mint and ensure that the central bank has the technological advantage in the upcoming currency wars that will happen as a result of the Great Depression of the 2020s and the monetary renegotiation, which I forecast will happen at the end of most likely this next war, depending on how far it escalates. So the central bank has been preparing for that technology. And the Royal Mint may not have been preparing for that technology, but it entering the non-fungible token means that it's starting to become a technology company and build technology expertise. Now, finally, at the top of this cycle is the banks. The banks control the vast majority of money today. They create digital currency every time they issue a loan, and they inevitably have to adjust to this changing environment where the Royal Mint could replace them with seigniorage income, or the central bank could replace them with a central bank digital currency, and lots of financial technology companies that plug in to that infrastructure. And so the banks need to remain, they're the incumbent with all these disruptors coming along. They've got the alternative financial sector, they've got the Royal Mint, they've got the regulators, they've got the central bank digital currencies, and so they need to maintain their effective control. They want everything to remain the status quo because they've got the best deal at the moment. They get to create money every time they issue a loan, and they get to create. Essentially, they are the beneficiaries of the world's largest regulated Ponzi scheme in history. as a result of being able to charge interest, the government outsourcing its seigniorage income, and they get to do it all through the creation of financial products that they can then sell to the investment bank, package up and sell to your pension, take all the risk off their balance sheet and take out all the profits. And obviously they only lend against assets that appreciate in value. So when you have inflation, they get to repossess all of those people that can't afford to pay their mortgages. When the central bank increases interest rates, they get to own all of the property and all of the real estate that they have first charge over in order to issue those loans. There was a reason why they wouldn't lend you any money to start your business, because there wasn't enough collateral behind it, but they would lend you money in order to purchase a loan that you couldn't afford and a car that you couldn't afford through the magic of financial engineering, money creation, and digital pounds. Now, let's rewind this all back. What is this about? It's about crypto assets and stable coins. The UK government know that there will be stable coins created by private companies, stable coins created by the Royal Mint, stable coins created by the central banks, stable coins created on top of Bitcoin, stable coins created on top of Ethereum, stable coins created by the private banks, stable coins created by big tech, and stable coins created by the IMF, the World Bank, and various other international financial institutions. So the upcoming currency war is a currency war around crypto assets and stable coins, competing with the ability for you to own your own money, spend your own money, and have a fixed supply that is dependent upon the success of proof of work. So check out the video on the environmental crisis so that you don't end up on the wrong side of financial history, not understanding the importance of proof of work and the importance of not ending up Bitcoin on some kind of proof of stake or alternative. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that video today. My job, as always, is to read between the lines, take the headlines, and try and get you a few hundred steps ahead of what comes next. So always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some people are going to get really hurt and read the headlines. Others are going to subscribe to this channel, do really well. So my hope is that you subscribe to this channel, hit the bell symbol, hit all, and share this video with as many people as you can. We're almost up to 78,000 subscribers, which is awesome, but I think it should be in the millions with everything that's going on in the world today. I will continue to deliver content. My ask is that you like, you share, and you share this with people that care about it so that we can ensure that they're on the right side of financial history. And guess what? We're going to be doing it with peace. We're going to be doing it with love. We're going to be doing it with unity. As the leaders of the world chuck around weapons of mass destruction and retaliate with financial weapons of mass destruction, we're all doing it with peace. Peace.